first like to welcome all of you here today. Founded in 1823, the Oxford Union has been a bastion of free speech and has held the most important conversations of our time. We are honoured to host this historic debate today and to have you all here. I'm the president of the Oxford Union, and on my right is the librarian, and on my left is the treasurer. Speakers in proposition today: Mr. David Walston, the owner of Furlough Farms. I am so happy to host you. Our seconder in the proposition today, Professor Andrew Fern, the Professor of Value Chain Management, Norwich Business School. We're so happy to host you. Speaker in opposition today, Baroness Rosie Boycott. We are also happy to host you today. And seconder, the head of the farming campaign, Miss Vicki. If I could please welcome our first speaker in proposition to open the debate for this House.
Your Royal Highness, my lords, ladies, gentlemen, and all the chickens hiding on the top floor. Unless you've been asleep, you know my name's David Walston, and I'm going to spend the next few minutes telling you why you need to be voting in favour of the motion that this House believes cheap food is worth the price. Now, when I'm not messing around in Oxford, I do like to pretend to be a farmer. Our farm takes up 900 hectares of good land, only a few miles from one of the two great university towns of the UK. That's Cambridge, by the way, not Hull. We grow wheat, barley, oats, and the other commodity crops that go into making cheap food. Now, I don't want to preempt anything, but perhaps the two ladies sitting here are going to say something about the cost of that cheap food that myself and my farming colleagues produce. Now, are we as farmers perfect? Well, definitely, certainly, 100% no. There's huge room for improvement, whether that's pesticide pollution, soil erosion, the treatment of livestock, or any one of 1,000 other things. Farming can be, and sometimes is, a complete disaster zone. But that doesn't mean we can't reflect, evolve, and improve. Now, there are two ways that this might happen. The first of them is the carrot. Unfortunately, most farmers, like myself, are dinosaurs, and we get highly suspicious of even the biggest, juiciest carrots dangling right in front of our faces, let alone the small, tiny ones off in the distance, like most of them actually are. We've been trying this approach for decades. Firstly, there's subsidies. You know, we get a great check every year, thank you very much. But also people like the AHDB, they do a great job in promoting best practice for farms. But without real money going into real research, there's a huge limit to what they can actually do. Farming's tricky. There aren't any silver bullets. Inertia's high, and change is a risk that farmers often don't want to take. Now, unfortunately, the real motivator for change is going to have to come from the stick. Because as much as agriculture is underinvested, and this bit's going to be popular, we're also under-regulated. As a farmer, my factory floor is the entire environment, and there's no reason I should be allowed unfettered access to treat it however I want in pursuit of profits, or of cheap food even. So backed up by proper, targeted, and applicable research, increased government regulation can not only make our environment better, but it can and should make our businesses more resilient as well and profitable. So that's why, even though the price of food might be high, we can fix that. We can, to misquote some of the finest political minds of our generation, get farming done. Now that brings me on to the cheap point of my argument. What does cheap actually mean? This is the critical thing for the whole argument. But unfortunately, we live in a world which is relative, not absolute. And there's no such thing as cheap or expensive, only affordable and unaffordable. And who here, apart from these two, are going to stand up and say they're not in favour of affordable food? Affordable food is something which probably everyone in this room has access to every day. Is it a luxury or is it a right? Well, happily, over the past century or so, it's become more of the latter and less of the former. So it's over that time period we've actually seen what's happened when affordable food has become available on a global scale. Now, how can I say this? It's pretty easy, really. We look at the manifestation of what happens when food becomes affordable, otherwise known as a famine. Now, we don't often talk about it, at least I wasn't taught about it in my substandard education, but the 10 worst famines of the 20th century saw over 50 million people die just from a lack of calories. From 1958 to 1962 in China, between 20 and 30 million people starved to death. In the 3 worst famines in the Soviet Union, another 17 million people died. Now, some people might look at that and say, well, it's not because we're not producing enough food, it's because the distribution's poor. But just ask yourself, do you think in the famines the rich people die, or is it only the poor people? There's always food around, and money always, always, always gets access to it. So if you think that that's not a good argument, or perhaps you're even one of those people who think sometimes the population needs to decrease, perhaps consider, would I volunteer to be one of the starving masses? And if not, which of my friends should take my place? So how do we make more food affordable for more people? Well, if you're poor, there's only one way to make it more affordable, and that's to make it cheap. Luckily, the combination of scientists and farmers have nailed that. In the past 70 years, the world's population has tripled, but the production of grains, which is a good proxy for the number of calories we farm, has quadrupled. And what do we all know? Supply and demand. More grain, cheaper prices. Cheaper prices, better affordability. And we know this is working because in the last couple of decades, the number of famines and the number of people dying from them has plummeted. So we're doing a good job. The problem then, of course, becomes how do we feed all these extra mouths? The population has gone up, it continues to go up, it will continue to go up, albeit at maybe a slightly reduced rate. So the question becomes, can we continue to increase our production while simultaneously learning to farm in a better and more responsible way? Well, I said it earlier, yes, we can. And I want to repeat the call for more government investment in agriculture. I mean, farming is a huge, complex business. It's not something that we as farmers can hope to untangle all by ourselves. Now, my final point is a bit more of a personal one. I'd like to see a show of hands from anyone in here who's died in the last year. No, just me? Well, I did spend 15 minutes dead last summer, although if there's any doctors here, they'd probably be able to tell you I did get better. In fact, there's some people questioning whether I should be standing up here doing this today. Perhaps I'm one of them. But actually, the famous food farming podcaster, Will Evans, who's in here, he has told me he wants to give me mouth to mouth if I collapse. So if that does happen, just let him get on with it. But one thing I've noticed, one thing I've come to realize, having been through that experience of being dead than alive, it's not that I'm like Jesus. It's that actually life isn't just about survival. Sometimes it's also about pleasure. I mean, take, for example, the prize that they're going to give the person for the best comment, a nice bottle of champagne, I think. I was going to make a joke about it being Guy Smith's, but I don't think he's here, so I won't bother.
You'd be surprised.
Oh. Come down here, then.
All I say is, Walston, as I do your father, the apple doesn't fall far from the tree.
You're not allowed to talk up there, so shh. I think it was a point of disorder, right. So the champagne, which Guy is obviously not getting, is it good? Well, just like with cheap and expensive food, there is no good and bad. It's all relative. The only thing that makes that bottle of champagne good is comparing it to complete rat's piss. You know, the kind of thing your mate Gareth makes in his basement and gives you a bottle of at Christmas every year. Think of it as the Pippi Longstocking argument. What is the point in school holidays when there is no school? What's the point in expensive, delicious treats when we don't have cheap, horrible gruel to compare it to? So in conclusion, I've got 3 main points. Yes, farming can be bad, but it doesn't have to be. We can fix it. Secondly, if you think we should only be eating delicious, nutritious food all the time, you're obviously against pleasure. And in my book, that makes you, at best, a weirdo, and at worst, a psychopath. Thirdly, if you think that there should be less food or food should be more expensive, you're in favor of killing poor people. So say yes to improving agriculture. Say yes to hedonism. That's a good one. Say yes to stopping starvation. But most importantly, and this goes for everyone, even you guys, say yes to this motion. Thank you.
Thank you for that amazing speech. I'd now like to welcome the Speaker in Opposition, Baroness Rosie Boycott, to open the case for the opposition. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Well, first of all, I'd like to say that I haven't been in a room with quite so many men for a long time. You beat the House of Lords. I have been looking around for the women's faces, and we have a better number. So something needs to change. David, I'm very glad you're alive. I read your blog, and it's very good news. I'm also very impressed by you as a farmer. I know you do no-till farming, but however, I take objection to almost everything else you said. So let's start by talking about what cheap food is. After the war, when I grew up, my parents spent about 30% of their family weekly income on food. It was a big deal. We had a chicken once every 2 weeks, maybe 12 times a year. They were a luxury. Over the intervening years, the price of food in terms of the family income has fallen from about 30% to under 10%. And it's that gap, it's that economic gap, my lords, ladies and gentlemen, that has allowed our economic miracles of our world to happen. We can have cars, TVs, clothes, we can have everything that we can think of. It has been made possible by this miracle. This miracle is cheap food. If you have cheap food, so to speak, the peasants don't revolt. And we all know enough of our history, modern and ancient and what, to know that if food is too expensive, you have political discord. So for the world, keeping food cheap has been really important. You only need look at the country of America and look at the way the big subsidies work on the big commodity foods. And then you start to look at where all those commodities are. And in fact, they're inside the food that fills the aisles of our supermarkets today. And you may say that we don't want to be hedonists. I mean, I love Coca-Cola. I love cheap food. I'm an absolute sucker for it. But I don't want it all the time. And I don't want it to be the stuff that is right in front of me. For instance, do you know that 98.8% of all food advertising in this country is on unhealthy food? Why? Because advertising works. I had an argument once with someone in Coca-Cola, and they said, look, just be clever. You only need drink one a month. And I said, that's not the point. So let's get to the facts of what cheap food does to our country. It is making our kids obese. It's making us obese, but let's stick with our kids, because it seems to me they're the innocent parties around this particular debate. 1 in 5 go into primary school overweight or obese. 1 in 3 leave primary school that way. Do you know that research has showed that if kids don't have healthy diets, they end up losing 18.3 months of educational attainment by the time they leave school? So that is a question not just of the ill health that we're banking up, but it's a question of equality. And I would hope that everyone in this room believes, as our Prime Minister always is saying, you know, we want an equal, thriving society. Our bodies are machines. They're the miracle machines of the world, and they need the right fuel. Now, if your fuel is Coca-Cola and a sandwich for breakfast, if it's on your way home from school, and when I ran the London Food Board, we used to fight about this a lot, but you go past chicken and chip shops, and when the kids come by, they have a notice, some of them, all over the country, 50p only for school children. We found 1 helping of chips in Tower Hamlets Borough. I didn't find it personally, but someone brought it to me. It was 1,800 calories for a helping of chips. The point about these chips, they were made from cheap potatoes. Now, maybe you all know a lot about this. I didn't know about cheap potatoes till I went to a factory in Essex. And I learned that cheap potatoes absorb more oil than the others. You're getting fat. So, what's this costing us? This is costing our NHS at the moment £6.1 billion. It's costing a huge amount in lost days at work, lost revenue, and inequality. That is because cheap food is bad food. I'm not arguing for people to pay more money for it. I'm arguing here that we have to relook at a system that has elapsed. It's elapsed for good reasons. We needed to feed the world. We did things. We powered up. We got big corporations. But now it is failing us. Do you know that in China now there are 250 million diabetics? They didn't have this 50 years ago. They didn't have it 30 years ago. What happened into intervening time? It wasn't that the Chinese lost their willpower. It was that our Western food system arrived. And our Western food system is about processed food. When I talk about cheap food, I talk about processed food because its cost is dramatic. We've done the cost on health. We've done the cost on our kids. So let's now turn to the cost to our farmers and to our environment. Overall in the UK, we spend £113 billion a year on the food system, the whole shamoozle. And of that, the farmer gets 8.1. Is that fair? No, it is not fair. My aunt was a farmer, and my uncle, and I grew up going to this farm in Oxfordshire. It's the longest place I knew in my life. And over the years, I watched as that farm went from wonderful and fertile and growing things through to my cousins trying pigs, having to give up because of the standards, and in the end, giving up altogether because they were being squeezed out by the big multinationals. They also didn't want, and I remember my cousin Anders saying this to me one day, he said, I don't want to be part of a factory. When I grow something, I want to know who eats it. I want to know that I'm growing it for you or for you. I don't want to think it's going into a kind of tube. This is not what I farm for. So that's very important as part of this process and why we have to fight against it. And of course, we must fight on the environmental front. We've already, I think everyone here knows what agriculture has done to biodiversity. Do you remember those days when we were young and we'd drive along and there'd be insects all over the window screen in the summertime? They've gone. They've gone because of the way we farm and the way we grow food. If you look, I mean, something that always amazes me, I buy a cheap chocolate mousse. Don't do it very often, but I like chocolate mousse. You can get 3 for £1. And if you look on the back, it says palm oil. So if you follow that back, that's an orangutan somewhere in Borneo that lost its livelihood for me to have this blasted chocolate mousse in, well, Sainsbury's, Judith, sorry. But who connected the Amazon fires with the grain to feed cattle? Who connects all these things? At the moment, nobody does. The world is very, very silent. Food causes, it seems to be a variable figure, but between 20 and 30% of global emissions. And if we just look from an environmental sense, we won't make any agreements unless we start to revolutionize farming. But the good news is that by revolutionizing it, we get to eat healthier and we get to get more money back in the farmer's pocket, which means that the food that they produce, if you can just sell more directly to the customer, you're going to start making more money. We're going to have healthier diets. Because quite frankly, we're sitting on a time bomb. We can't have all these unhealthy kids. We can't have all these unhealthy adults. We can't have this system all around the world. And we can't grow enough of this kind of food to feed the world. So there are lots of brilliant ideas out there about how we can remodel this. And I think I probably don't have time to go into them. How long have I been? I've got 1 minute. So how can I convince you to vote for this motion? Please vote against it. Sorry, I don't mean for it. Please vote against it. Because I do not mean to put down any farmer. I love farmers. I had a small farm myself, which is what got me interested in food. But we have to change the way we do it. We have to reconnect and grow real food. This is why you all farm. And in the end, it's why I eat. It's because I want to eat proper stuff. As my friend and guru, Michael Pollan, says, eat food, not too much, mostly vegetables. It's not a bad motto to live by. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Rosie. You must have an encyclopedic memory. You had a vast number of facts about the impact of food, but nothing was really to do with the price of it. And I think it's time that I injected an element of commercial reality into what we're talking about. In 1691, a gentleman philosopher called John Locke wrote about, first time, the law of supply and demand. And this was about the fact that the availability and the appeal of a product will impact its price. And he argued there should be no government intervention, but things should be allowed to establish what he called a free market. Interesting man. His alma mater, Oxford University. I find it unthinkable that in this place of learning that the opposition, my friends over there, should be considering undoing a foundation of economics that is over 300 years old. And our government and our Competition and Markets Authority have stuck to this. They wait for proof of a market failure before they even consider any intervention. And as those of us who've been at the conference today will have heard, there are often unintended consequences of intervention. 60 years of the Milk Marketing Board ended up with farmers getting the lowest price for milk in the EU, and we had a milk shortage. 10 years ago, Government and Competition and Markets Authority intervened in the relationship between retailers and their suppliers. They felt there was an imbalance of power, and the risks being passed to suppliers were leading to small suppliers being put out of business and large suppliers stopping innovating. And as a result, they introduced the legally binding Grocery Supply Code of Practice and my role as Groceries Code Adjudicator. And I make sure that the retailers pay people on time. They give them reasonable notice when anybody's going to make any changes to contracts, and make sure that if they're asking a supplier to use a third party, that there's no backhander going on between the supplier and the retailer. But crucially, my role has nothing to do with price. I've been in the role for 7 years. Has it worked? I think so. The majority of the farmers that are affected by this are actually fresh produce growers. And over that period of time, they have had longer contracts, better collaboration with the retailers, and this relationship has been leading to greater efficiency. There's been mutual investment, and it will continue to drive down price. I see this as a functioning market. Supply and demand are relatively in balance. There's inward investment, there's expansion, there's new entrants. We're still getting cheap food, but it's a market that's working. I accept that there might be a need for more regulation in order to make sure we have a level playing field, whether it be on welfare or environment, but we need to let the market compete. And, sorry, I've got it in my notes here. Some of you may know I haven't had as much time to prepare as some of the others. But my friends opposite will make the point that unhealthy food often appears cheaper or more affordable. But those sorts of calculations are based on calories. And do you know, you have there are as many calories in 1.5 cucumbers as 1 ginger biscuit. It's ridiculous to do an analysis that's based on calories. And as Alice told us earlier on today, we should be looking at nutrition. Now, we have had some intervention. We've had the sugar tax. I thought that was working. Someone today said it wasn't, but I felt it was working. We've also have healthy start vouchers, which ensures that people on low incomes can have access to milk and fruit and veg. And there's probably more to come. But none of this is because food is too cheap. And if retailers choose to subsidize food in order to bring people into their supermarkets, that is just a free market working. But I shudder at the idea of the alternative, where food is priced on a cost-plus basis. This has happened to a degree in defence. And the HMS Elizabeth, the air carrier, cost twice as much as it was meant to, $3 billion over budget, and was years late. I realise that some of what I'm saying may be condemning some farmers to farmer to loss, but pushing up the price to help them is not the answer. Some of the answer might be in scale, and this can be achieved through joint ventures, and it can be achieved through cooperatives. I'm a director of a farming cooperative, and I know that helps drive down prices for the 3,500 members. And I'm sure many of you envy members of the farmers who set up Arla, Tulip, Fonterra, who are regularly paid dividends to the growers based on their whole organisation. But I feel before I should end, I should point out that there is a misconception that cheap food is produced unsustainably. The fact that bad practice exists should not be confused with it being a blind pursuit of cost savings. The best farmers can produce at the lowest cost and without degrading the environment and without putting their animals through appalling conditions. It's not in the long-term interest of the farmers either. So I feel I should conclude by stating the obvious. Increasing the price of food is not going to make people more healthy. It's not going to make growers more efficient. And it's not going to help those who can't afford good food. So my advice to farmers is to continue to focus on economic efficiency, as those stakeholders prepared to pay more are few and often fickle. I would like to conclude with a point that I'm sure John Locke would agree with me, that a free market leads to food at the right price. Thank you.
Thank you for that wonderful speech. I'd now like to welcome the second side opposition, Vicki Hurd, to continue the case for side opposition. Thank you.
Thank you, Your Highness. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you. I think the true cost of food has been well presented by Rosie. Billions hurting the economy, billions in cost to the NHS budget, a poor deal to farmers, compromised animal welfare, compromised environment, soil, and increasing pressure to tackle these for the climate change crisis that we're facing. For consumers, the shop price is mostly false. That's what we've got to recognise here. It reflects neither the time and the cost that you as farmers or your workers here and overseas put in, the time that you put in, nor are the external costs incorporated, the planetary and human health costs of producing that food. Yes, we've brought cheap in other areas, like cars, clothing, phones, and that must change. Globally, the true cost of everything needs to be calculated into the goods. But we can't wait for that to happen, and it may never happen. We cannot wait for that to happen. Food is too important. The land is too important. Climate and nature emergencies are here, and they are too important to leave alone. Farmers and decent farming livelihoods must be too important to lose sight of. So what we need to do is understand what has made food so cheap. How can we influence that problem to try and ensure that we can pay farmers the right price, the cost plus price of producing and investing in your land, in your animals, in your workers, and in your wildlife, and in your community? How can we make sure that that is done? How can we influence it? Can we rewrite these rules? In reality, we've left the decisions globally in the hands of others for far too long, in the blind faith that cheap food is a sort of public good. I think our proposers were slightly implying that it's a public good. But given all the costs that we know, we absolutely know, to the environment, to our health, that public good has been eroded. And we've also had the blind faith that the supermarkets, the food service sector, the trader know best. We've let them decide what to do with your grain, your vegetables, your milk, and at what price. Because they are wanting you to produce ever more cheaply. But that is really harmful, and it cheapens food. It devalues food. As the chair of your conference said in a recent article, we're not likely to persuade anyone of the value of good food, even hedonistic food, if we keep the cost of it artificially low. And I totally agree with that. Some might justify this by saying it's providing food for the poorest. I'm really sorry, my mouth's gone completely dry, thank you. Some might justify by saying it's providing food for the poorest, food at all price points. We should just make it cheap and make it the best we can at that price and use high tech, whatever it takes to do it. That is understandable, but I believe that is mistaken. How low can any of us, and how low can you really afford to go? How much lower is the price you're going to take? We need to be proposing, I totally agree with David here, we need to be proposing affordable. Affordable for everyone at the right time and the right price, but not cheap. And ensuring people have incomes to afford it, not the other way around. I can hear others saying that it's all very well, but get in the real world, Vicki. You haven't a clue, you're idealistic. We have no power to change the status quo. We're tiny businesses up against huge commodity markets, traders, powerful corporations and retailers. We have no agency, especially with the government hell-bent on global trade deals with agri-food and easy stake to play negotiations. The race to the bottom is inevitable. I don't agree. Another way is possible. And that is my final section to you. You can actually do things differently. Consumers are already recognizing the value of good food and buying quality and standard. We know that. It's increasingly being what the retailers are telling us their consumers want to buy. Values are going up the agenda. Growth in organic, free range shows this. Good quality is or should be good business. I think you would all agree with that. Farmers, as Christine pointed out, here and overseas, are doing things differently. Selling direct through decent food traders, like Better Food Traders. Huge cooperative in Germany. It's now 15,000 farmers, grown from 8 farmers. And they're getting a far greater return on their produce and building a whole new financing system for how they build their businesses. And Arla and Danish Crown have been mentioned. These are huge cooperatives where farmers are colleagues, not competitors, and are gaining the right price for their produce and selling at the right price more directly to their consumers. So it is happening. Countries too have taken action successfully, changing the economics of food to favour less cheap junk food that Rosie was talking about, such as steps to curb junk food marketing and advertising. It's not system change, it's not enough, but it's a start. We have food power projects across the country, 60 of them, helping families on low incomes to access better food through all sorts of systems. Italy and France directly buy fresh from local farmers for school food. And there are emerging really exciting urban food policies that we should learn from, like the Nordic Way, which is an amazing country initiative to make sure farmers are getting the right deal and consumers are benefiting and the environment is benefiting. So I would say that UK farmers can change the system so we don't have to have cheap food. We have affordable food at the right price. And it needs 4 things I'll do very quickly. Firstly, you need to vote against this proposition now. Show that the farm community understands that affordable, climate and nature friendly and fair is needed, but not cheap. Give that message. Secondly, don't fall for the nasty political trick that says you have to sell your produce ever cheaper in order to fix poverty and prevent people resorting to emergency food banks. Fixing poverty is about wages. It's about benefits and incomes and pensions and curbing excessive housing and other costs. It's much about that than it is about the food price. That's absolutely clear from the data. Farmers are shouldering this burden unfairly. Cheap food won't fix poverty. You need to show that by voting against this and aligning yourself with other campaigns. Thirdly, and we know this is not easy, and I totally agree with Christine in mentioning this, you need to collaborate and cooperate more. Form trading platforms. So you become price makers, not price takers. So you can connect more closely with consumers and, yes, even commodity producers. Make liaisons with millers, smaller manufacturers. I hear loads of that at the Oxford Real Farming Conference. There's loads of it going on. It's happening. Get the data. Be far more closely involved in the market that you're selling to. And I think Andrew Fern would have made that point if he'd been sitting there. But finally, my fourth, 1 minute, fine. My most important change is to change the politics. Take political action. All of you should take political action to end the cheap food agenda now. Demand system change via policies to rebalance the power into farmers' hands and stop below-cost selling. So planning, competition, groceries code, expansion of the groceries code adjudicator, the wonderful work that Christine's been doing, at subsidies, and to ensure that we can invest so farmers can collate, process, and market their own produce. But you should show solidarity with campaigns for better income, welfare and wages, and campaigns to stop junk food becoming economic. So join us in those campaigns. Please, we need you. Finally, get protection from cheap imports. I think for that, you need to get on your tractors. You need to join Minette in her march in London. Make the case on the streets soon, because otherwise we're going to see a real problem that cheap food will be flooding in and there's nothing you can do about it. You need to write to your MP, mag them, make the case that you should not be sold out in a cheap food agenda. A lack of action has led to ever lower prices for you and ever weakened health status for the population and for the environment. Do you want to let that happen, or do you want to do what you can? Thank you.
Thank you for that amazing speech. I'd now like to open the debate to the floor for members of the audience to make a two-minute contribution to the debate. If I could have a speaker in proposition to start the floor speeches. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Chairman, Your Royal Highness, my lords, ladies and gentlemen. Cheap food is not something to be afraid of. Indeed, I believe it should be an aspiration. Now, I farm about 20 miles away, and the way we grow cheap food is to grow higher yields or with using less resources. And as a nation of farmers, we're fantastically good at doing that. But I'm we're producing about 4 times as much food as we were 100 years ago. But I'm sitting on a productivity plateau. And why am I sitting on that productivity plateau? Because the tools I use to do my job are being taken away from me. Neonics, triazoles, a raft of other chemistry. Now, I don't want to use chemistry to grow food, as long as I've got access to technologies that can help me grow food better. The problem is we're denied that access to those technologies, which is why we're being forced to say that our food is expensive to grow. So let's have a look at some of those technologies. For example, GM camelina, developed by British scientists at Rothamsted, funded by British taxpayers, and offering cheap, healthy oils and that don't damage the world's fish stocks. And where's that likely to be developed? Where's that going to be commercialized? In Canada and North America. And then there's GM blight-resistant potatoes, developed by British scientists at the Sainsbury Laboratory and NIAB, and offering a fantastic reduction in pesticide use. And where's that going to be commercialized? In America. Even wheat. We have GM iron-rich wheat developed by scientists at the John Innes Centre, British scientists. It offers a cheap food solution to one of the world's fundamental food-related illnesses, anemia. And where's that going to be? Here in this country, we have the best wheat-growing land and the best wheat-growing farmers. But are we going to be allowed to grow this wheat? No, because a bunch of bureaucrats in Brussels have ruled against it. So, we can grow cheap food. We can grow cheap food that saves lives. We can grow cheap food that meets our net zero ambitions, Minette. And what's the price? All we have to do is open our eyes, explore what's possible, put our faith in the science. These brilliant innovations sitting in our labs and our greenhouses across the UK, they're not going to start saving lives and providing cheap food until they're put in the hands of farmers. Sorry, just 20 seconds. British and Northern Irish farmers who can co-create with our brilliant scientists cheap food solutions for a hungry world, who can show consumers that this is not a food to be feared, this is a food to be revered. So, vote with your hearts and your heads, and vote through the eye door, okay? Thank you.
Thank you for that speech. I'd now like one speaker inside opposition of the debate.
As ever, we always struggle to follow Tom's train of thought. I felt that Rosie needed a man on her side, although I'm aware that I've unwittingly declared my gender. Ladies and gentlemen, cheap food is a disgrace. We should be ashamed that supermarkets are falling over themselves to sell 4 pints of milk for £1. We are an affluent society. We only spend 9% of our household income on food. There isn't one person in this room that could not afford to pay more for their food. Now, I'm well aware, as Sally Mercer put eloquently today, there is a poor section of our society that only have, say, £5 to pay for a meal for 5 of them. And we have to take that into account. We should subsidise the provision of healthy food for people like that, with voucher schemes, food banks, or whatever you like. But Dimbleby himself said that cheap food has exacerbated health issues. So let's have a fat tax. Let's, for example, on our tax returns every year, let's have a box where we put our BME in it, for example, BMI. Let us encourage the milk buyers for the supermarkets to change jobs to become tax weight inspectors. So let's penalise the production of unhealthy, cheap food and reward the producers of good food. And cheap food is definitely not worth the price. You must vote against the motion, ladies and gentlemen.
Your Royal Highness, Madam President, having a VIP in the room means that we're not going to get the usual stream of tasteless remarks and bad jokes, which leaves me little to say, I suppose, for the rest of the evening. So I'm perhaps going to turn to semantics. This debate in the motion is food. Well, most of us are farmers. We don't produce food. We produce world-traded agricultural raw commodities. Food is what is at Tesco's or Safer, or what we're going to get at Christchurch in a minute. And that's certainly not affordable food. But I was pretty uncertain which side I wanted to go. But one of the two fells made up my mind which side I should come to, and so I've come on your side, David. If only for your dad, because when you get back home, if you say you've lost, it won't be much fun. So, yeah, well, but to me, you made a wonderful point. And that is what swayed it for me. And that was that for a huge majority of the population, food needs to be cheap to make it affordable. We're a privileged part of society that we can afford whatever food we price. But there's a big lot of the weekly shop and the budget is looked very close at. So, David, you made that point. I'm going to go through your door, but unless somebody says something rather better that moves me to that side, or perhaps if the queue is less and I can get to Christchurch a bit quicker, but at the moment, I'm with you.
One speaker inside opposition of the debate. If I could have the lady in green, please.
Thank you. We've heard an awful lot about cost, but in the words of MasterCard, I'd like to talk about something that's priceless. It probably won't concern a lot of you in the room, but as a very proud Welsh woman, something that we're forgetting here, that cheap food actually affects culture and language. So in Wales, our rural communities are underpinned by farms, and they need to be viable. Now, 50% of Welsh speakers reside in those rural communities. So to continue to provide and cheap food means that farms become unsustainable, especially with the phasing out direct subsidies. So actually, we stand to lose an awful lot more. We lose culture that has been part of our heritage, for thousands of years, and that is irreplaceable. So I would like to move the House to vote against this proposal. Thank you.
Thank you for that speech. If I could have one more speaker inside proposition of the motion, please.
I think this debate has devolved away from cheap food, from affordable food through cheap calories. I think that's an incorrect argument to make. What we're saying here is that not all food should be cheap, and that we shouldn't be taxed because, well, I'm post-Christmas 14 stone, I like a steak bake. I don't want to be taxed because I prefer that side of food because it is cheaper. What I'm saying is that we should be saying that all food should be affordable, not just the fact that there is cheaper food available. It's not cheap food versus expensive food. This is affordable food versus cheap calories. And I strongly urge the House to vote in favour of this, because we do need cheap food. It is an essential part of life. We don't need cheap calories. They can be done with, but we don't need to be taxed to tell us what we can and can't eat.
Thank you for that speech. If I could have the last floor speech for tonight inside opposition of the debate.
Thank you. Surely the answer is very simple. We've heard tonight that 98% of food advertising is promoting unhealthy food. So advertising clearly works. So as we know, we've got a ticking time bomb of obesity, may even affect some people in this room. You know who you are. Like cigarettes, perhaps we should ban TV, radio, newspaper, and internet advertising. We could ban all adverts for unhealthy food. I'm loving it, but every little helps when you walk through that no door tonight. Thank you.
Thank you. I think it was quite a clear winner of the floor speeches today. I'd like to pick the first speaker in opposition of the floor speeches as the winner of the floor speeches for tonight. Thank you. Yes. Thank you for tonight. I'd now like to welcome the proposer inside proposition to summarise the case for tonight. Thank you.
I've learned a few things in the last half an hour. Firstly, my handwriting's terrible and I can't read anything I've written down. Secondly, perhaps more worryingly, apparently I was supposed to drop the tasteless remarks and bad jokes, so I didn't get that memo. So sorry about that. We agree, Rosie and I agree, farming needs to improve. We've been through that. Yes, it needs to improve, but I don't see what that's got to do with cheap food specifically. Paying farmers more is not going to make them better. If you think that paying a farmer double the amount of money per tonne of his wheat is going to suddenly make him invest it in a lot of good things, you obviously haven't seen many farmers' Bentleys or their skiing holidays they've been on. Another thing, making food more expensive does not make it better. You know, Stephen Felders came up and said how cheap milk is. Are we saying cheap milk is a bad food because it's cheap? Of course not. That's actually just a complete non-argument as far as I'm concerned. Also, we heard earlier from the gentleman from Greggs, not earlier this morning, that having more expensive food with the sugar tax doesn't actually always reduce its appeal. So even making the bad food more expensive isn't necessarily going to have the desired outcome. Now, finally, I've got to say thank you to Vicki, because I suspect I'm not the first old Etonian to stand here and shout at people, but I almost certainly am the first one who's been made to look like the compassionate side of the argument. Vicki said food needs to be more expensive, so we appreciate it. Now, standing here...
Affordable.
No, you said it needs to be cheaper. You say it needs to be more expensive, we appreciate it, but also affordable. Now, saying it needs to be more expensive and affordable, you said it needs to be more expensive because if it's too cheap, you don't appreciate it. These are your words. If a food is too cheap, you don't appreciate it. Now, to stand up in Oxford before going to Christchurch and say, I think food needs to be more expensive, so we appreciate it. You know, were you in the conference this morning when the lady was talking about the man who spent a year eating bread and butter because that's all he could afford? Should that bread and butter have been more expensive? Should he have been eating Guernsey sea-salted butter on artisan sourdough loaf? Of course not. That is not the thing. Food needs to be affordable. That is the compassionate thing. There's a reason why voting ayes is turning right, because it is the right thing to do. That's what you should do. Thank you.
Thank you for that speech. I'd now like to welcome the opposer inside opposition to close the debate as a whole. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you all very much for coming. It's been entertaining, at the least. I hope you will vote against this motion. I think there's a great confusion here to do with food poverty and cheap food. The point is, food should be affordable for all of us. The fact that a lot of people in this country don't have enough money all over the world is not the responsibility of such as the farmers. It's the responsibility of a system failure that is paying you farmers too little, that the whole processing part of the industry, come back to that figure, 8 billion to the farmer, 113 billion in the food system. Something's not right there. I think we can all agree that a lot of people are getting very sick on unhealthy diets. That's what I mean by the cheap food. It's the bad calories that you eat, which are available, which are incredibly delicious, which are marketed to all of us. And we have to work against that for the good of everybody. But also, I think now we don't have a choice. I mean, our biodiversity, our soil, the climate problem, all these things are coming at us like thunderclaps. We're not going to be able to go on like this. It's not just that farming has to change. The food system has to have a revolution. What Henry Dimbleby's been talking about has to come through. And one of the things is that good food should be available for all of us, and we should be proud of it. England, Britain, the UK, we should lead the world as having good food. I'm not at all against great tech. I think things like the small robot company and all those things are genius. We need them. Let's bring them on. Some kinds of GM is also genius as well. I would say I'm against Monsanto because of some of the things, the implications of that size of company. But of course we should embrace technology. The wonderful thing, say, about the drone company is that you could have no-till agriculture and a little guy that goes around and deals with weeds individually. But we cannot go on with all the neonicotinoids and all the things that have destroyed our biodiversity. We are all paying the price. I mean, it's all very well for us to say this is very cheap food, but actually it's on my tax bill, on your tax bill, what the NHS is paying, what the loss of this and the loss of that and the environmental cost. We have to face up to the fact that this, I'm sorry here about this, but you said this is not market failure. I would say it's market failure. Across the world, a third of the world eats okay, a third of the world is overweight, and a third of the world doesn't have enough. You call that a successful system? It isn't. It's a failing system, and we all have to do something about it. And actually, all of you lot in this room are absolutely the people who can. So please vote with Vicki and I. Go out whichever door it is that takes you against this. No, in that case, the other way. And we'll see you all later at Christchurch, and we can argue over the price of the starter. Thank you.
Thank you for that wonderful speech and what was an amazing debate. If once exiting, you could choose to walk through the eyes or the nose to reflect the position you've taken on the debate. I'm Melanie Onovo, Christchurch, and I'm your president.